Midway Atoll sat isolated in the vast Pacific, a tiny speck of land that Admiral Chester Nimitz knew held extraordinary strategic value. By late May 1942, somewhere beneath Pearl Harbor's administrative buildings, in a cramped basement workspace that most officers wouldn't set foot in, the fate of the entire Pacific War was being decided through mathematics and intuition, rather than military might. On May 20th, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer stood in that basement, holding intercepted Japanese messages that trembled slightly in his exhausted hands. His eyes, which hadn't properly closed in 3 days, scanned the decoded text with growing comprehension. 2 carriers, 7 cruisers, and numerous destroyers were heading toward a target the Japanese called AF. The implications were staggering. The basement itself was little more than a dungeon. No windows meant no natural light. The ventilation system barely functioned, leaving the air thick and stale by afternoon. IBM tabulating machines hummed constantly, their mechanical clicking mixing with the endless cigarette smoke that hung in clouds around the workstations. One visitor would later describe it as the most depressing military workspace in the entire Pacific. Yet this freezing, poorly ventilated basement had become the nerve center of American naval intelligence. Commander Joseph John Rochefort moved through the cramped space in his red smoking jacket and slippers, clothing he'd worn for so many consecutive days that his staff had stopped remarking on it. His desk bore a sign reading, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." The message reflected the peculiar reality of Station Hypo. To outsiders, Rochefort looked like he belonged in a hospital rather than at the helm of the Navy's most critical intelligence operation. Yet this disheveled figure possessed perhaps the most formidable cryptanalytic mind in the entire United States Navy. What Japanese commanders planning their massive operation couldn't possibly imagine was that their most sophisticated naval code had already been broken. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed their communications system represented the absolute pinnacle of cryptographic security. They operated under the conviction that Americans simply lacked the linguistic ability and mathematical sophistication to even attempt breaking JN-25, let alone succeed. Station Hypo's basement team processed roughly 140 Japanese messages daily, with that number climbing as May progressed. They worked in what Rochefort called the dungeon, processing information that would determine whether the United States Navy would be ready or ambushed. The team numbered between 30 to 50 personnel at its peak, but these weren't ordinary sailors. They were the Navy's finest minds. Lieutenant Commander Wesley Ham Wright resembled the actor Wallace Beery, but his mathematical genius far exceeded his physical resemblance to any Hollywood star. Colleagues watched him disappear into complex problems for 48 hours straight, sustained purely by coffee and sheer determination. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan had actually survived the Pearl Harbor attack when the USS Tennessee took direct hits and burned. Pulled from that inferno, he'd channeled his rage and grief into code breaking with an intensity that sometimes alarmed even Rochefort himself. His colleagues called him their Babe Ruth, celebrating his ability to crack especially difficult cryptanalytic problems. Marine Major Alva Red Laswell served as chief translator, a mathematical prodigy who'd never finished high school, yet possessed an almost supernatural understanding of Japanese language patterns. Visitors observed him hunched over Japanese text, a green eyeshade pulled low against the fluorescent lights, a cigar clenched firmly between his teeth, completely absorbed in the work. Commander Thomas Dyer, the mathematical architect behind crucial breakthroughs, maintained the sign on his desk that captured the unit's strange atmosphere. After marathon sessions, witnesses would find him emerging unshaven, eyes bloodshot from sleep deprivation, moving with the careful steps of someone approaching complete exhaustion. By May 1942, this small team had recovered enough of JN-25B's complex structure to read approximately 40% of intercepted traffic. Not enough for perfect word-by-word translations, but sufficient for what intelligence professionals called gisting, determining the essential meaning and operational significance of Japanese communications. The Japanese had introduced JN-25 in 1939, replacing an older system that had served since 1931. Japanese cryptographers in the Navy's 4th Department Communications believed they'd created an unbreakable system. The code contained approximately 30,000 code groups in its initial version, expanding to nearly 45,000 by 1942, each representing a 5-digit number divisible by 3. This mathematical feature, designed to identify transmission errors, would ironically become the Americans' first foothold into the system. Words, phrases, and syllables were first encoded using massive codebooks, then disguised through false additives using random numbers from cipher tables containing 50,000 possible variations. Captain Ito Tsunezo, the officer personally overseeing JN-25's development, would later admit during post-war interrogations that they believed the system was absolutely secure. The mathematical combinations seemed astronomical, far beyond what human calculation could manage. What Japanese military planners failed to anticipate was that Americans would adapt commercial IBM tabulating equipment, machines originally designed for census data and accounting, into sophisticated cryptanalytic tools. These machines could sort through millions of combinations, identify patterns completely invisible to human analysis, and complete in hours calculations that would require teams of mathematicians years to accomplish manually. When JN-25B replaced JN-25A on December 1, 1940, just over a year before Pearl Harbor, American crypt analysts faced devastating news. Months of painstaking work had become essentially useless. They would need to start completely over, rebuilding their understanding of the new system, while war clouds gathered ominously over the Pacific. By December 7, 1941, the team had recovered only enough to read perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted messages. They could sense increased Japanese naval activity, but not enough to determine where the strike would land. The breakthrough in mechanization came through understanding human weakness rather than pure mathematics. Cryptanalyst Thomas Dyer realized that Japanese radio operators, despite explicit instructions to begin coding at random points in their cipher tables, habitually defaulted to convenient positions like page 1, line 1, or other easily remembered locations. This human pattern created weaknesses that IBM machines could identify and ruthlessly exploit. An IBM run in April 1942 revealed something extraordinary. The machines identified that certain groups appeared repeatedly at the beginning of messages. Hamwright theorized these might represent numerals, since Japanese messages often began with references like your message number 473. Comparing these patterns with an old Japanese diplomatic code that the Navy had obtained years earlier confirmed Wright's hypothesis perfectly. The Japanese were using the exact same numeral encoding system they had considered obsolete. The custom modifications to IBM equipment had become remarkably sophisticated. By spring 1941, the Navy had commissioned machines with over 75 special attachments designed exclusively for cryptanalytic functions. These customized machines could perform depth analysis, identifying messages encoded with identical additive sequences in minutes rather than days. One Navy report documented that comparing two 200-letter messages for patterns required 10 hours of skilled manual analysis, while IBM equipment completed the identical comparison in under 3 minutes. The investment was enormous for the era. The Navy spent hundreds of thousands of dollars annually on IBM equipment rental and custom modifications. The machines consumed such tremendous amounts of electricity that Station Hypo required its own dedicated power supply. Without these machines, breaking JN-25 would have remained impossible. The Imperial Japanese Navy's confidence in JN-25 bordered on absolute religious faith. Commander Yamamoto Yuji, a senior cryptographic officer, would testify after the war that they believed Americans incapable of understanding Japanese at the level required for cryptanalysis. Combined with their mathematical security measures, they believed JN-25 was not merely unbreakable, but that Americans wouldn't even seriously attempt to break it. This arrogance permeated Japanese military thinking entirely. The Naval General Staff's intelligence assessment in 1941 stated that fewer than 100 Americans possessed sufficient Japanese language skills for military translation, and none possessed the rare combination of linguistic and mathematical expertise required for cryptanalysis. They were catastrophically wrong. The U.S. Navy had systematically trained officers in Japanese since the 1920s, sending them to live in Japan and achieve near-native fluency. Japanese leaders made another critical error in assuming that code security depended solely on mathematical complexity. They ignored the human factors that create vulnerabilities in any cryptographic system. Radio operators under pressure used shortcuts. Tired clock operators began encoding at convenient starting points. Weather stations transmitted reports at identical times using predictable formats. Supply officers dispatched requisitions filled with stereotyped language. Each pattern provided what crypt analysts call cribs, known or guessed plaintext that could unlock entire messages. Even more damaging was the Japanese Navy's institutional rigidity. The same military culture that produced unwavering loyalty prevented critical examination of security procedures. When unusual events occurred, American carriers appearing at precisely the right defensive positions, submarines waiting along secret routes, naval leadership attributed these coincidences to superior American reconnaissance rather than communications compromise. Post-war testimony revealed the profound depths of this delusion. Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, Yamamoto's chief of staff, stated even after the war ended that when Americans told them they had been reading their codes, many officers refused to believe it. They insisted there must have been traitors within their ranks, rather than accepting that their system had been compromised. On April 28, 1942, Station Hypo intercepted a message that electrified the basement crew. Japanese naval forces were ordered to complete all preparations and await further orders. The target was designated only as AF. Rochefort had seen this designator before. His team had tracked AF references for weeks, noting that whenever Japanese forces operated near Midway Atoll, the designation appeared in communications. Correlation wasn't proof, however, and Washington's codebreakers at OP-20G insisted AF meant the Aleutian Islands, or possibly Hawaii itself. The disagreement raged through early May, with Admiral Nimitz caught between conflicting intelligence assessments from Pearl Harbor and Washington. Rochefort desperately needed proof that would settle the matter conclusively. The solution came from Jasper Holmes, a submarine officer forcibly retired due to arthritis, but recalled to serve in intelligence. Holmes understood Midway's critical vulnerability intimately. The island's entire water supply depended on a single desalination plant. On May 19th, Rochefort proposed Holmes's deception to Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer. Using the secure underwater cable connecting Pearl Harbor to Midway, a line the Japanese couldn't possibly tap, they would instruct Midway's garrison to broadcast an emergency message in plain language, reporting that their water distillation plant had suffered an explosion. The trap was set on May 20th. Midway broadcast the fake distress call on frequencies the Japanese routinely monitored. Within 24 hours, Japanese intelligence at Kwajalein intercepted the American message and immediately reported it back to Combined Fleet Headquarters in JN-25 encrypted traffic. AF is short of fresh water due to failure of distillation plant. When Station Hypo decoded this Japanese message on May 22nd, the basement erupted in celebration and vindication. They had not only confirmed Midway as the target, but also proven beyond doubt that they were reading current Japanese operational traffic in real time. The Japanese had completely swallowed the deception, never questioning why Americans would broadcast such obviously sensitive information in plain, unencrypted text. Knowing where the Japanese would attack proved crucial, but Nimitz needed to know exactly when. Japanese messages included date-time groups that were super-enciphered, encrypted separately before being encoded in JN-25. This additional security layer had frustrated American crypt analysts for months. The breakthrough came through painstaking analysis of weather reports transmitted by Japanese meteorological stations. Joseph Finnegan noticed that Japanese weather stations transmitted at precise times each day, and their reports always included the date and time of observation. By comparing hundreds of these messages with known transmission times, Finnegan and Wright gradually constructed a table that could convert enciphered date-time groups back into readable dates. On May 24th, the system finally revealed its secret. A message from Yamamoto specified that N-Day, the operation's launch date, would be June 4th, with the aircraft attack commencing at 0200 Tokyo time. Another intercept confirmed the Midway invasion force would arrive on June 7th, 3 days after the carrier strike. Edwin Layton, reviewing these decrypts, made his famous prediction to Admiral Nimitz. "Admiral, the Japanese will attack Midway on June 4th. They will approach from the northwest, bearing 325 degrees. They will launch their aircraft at 0400 local time from a position 175 miles from Midway." Nimitz studied his intelligence officer carefully before responding. "You're confident in this assessment, Layton?" "Admiral, I'll be wrong by 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles at most." On June 4, 1942, at 0534 local time, a PBY Catalina flying boat spotted the Japanese carrier force at bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles from Midway. The intelligence had been virtually perfect. The crown jewel of Station Hypo's code-breaking came on May 20th with the interception of Operational Order 14. This massive 12-part message contained Yamamoto's entire battle plan, including force composition, timing, and coordination between the Midway attack and diversionary operations. The decoded sections revealed staggering operational details. The first carrier striking force under Admiral Nagumo would approach Midway from the northwest with 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships would carry 248 aircraft. The invasion force would include 5,000 troops aboard 12 transport vessels. Support forces would include 7 battleships, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Most crucially, intercepts in early May confirmed that 2 of Japan's newest carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, damaged at the Coral Sea, would not participate. This reduced Japanese carrier strength from 6 to 4, dramatically improving American odds. Other intercepted messages filled in operational details with remarkable precision. A May 13th communication revealed submarine deployments. Submarine Squadron 3 will establish patrol line 150 miles northwest of Hawaii by N2 day. Knowing this, Nimitz ordered his carriers to depart Pearl Harbor on May 28th and 30th, before the Japanese submarines arrived on June 2nd. Supply messages exposed the operation's massive scale. One intercept specified fuel requirements in meticulous detail. Tanker Group will provide 2,800 tons heavy oil, 1,200 tons aviation fuel at position 30 degrees north, 170 degrees east on N+3 day. Such details not only confirmed timing, but revealed vulnerability. The Japanese were operating at the absolute extreme limit of their logistical capabilities, stretched thin and dependent on precise coordination. Not everyone believed Station Hypo's analysis. In Washington, Commander John Redmond headed OP-20G, the Navy's main cryptanalytic center, and he fundamentally disagreed with Rochefort's methods and conclusions. Where Rochefort relied on linguistic understanding and intuitive pattern recognition, Redmond emphasized pure mathematical analysis and formal procedures. The Redmond brothers, John in cryptanalysis and his brother Rear Admiral Joseph as Director of Naval Communications, wielded considerable political influence. They convinced Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, that Rochefort was a maverick ignoring proper channels and feeding Nimitz unreliable intelligence based on wishful interpretation. On May 14th, OP-20G issued a formal intelligence estimate stating the Japanese target was probably the Aleutian Islands, possibly the west coast of the United States. They accused Hypo of wish fulfillment, claiming the team saw what they wanted to see in ambiguous intercepts. The bureaucratic battle nearly derailed American preparations entirely. Admiral King, who disliked Rochefort's unmilitary appearance and his direct communication with Nimitz bypassing normal channels, was inclined to side with Washington's establishment cryptanalysts. It took Nimitz's forceful involvement, driven by critical water supply issues at Midway, to keep the operation in focus. Even after the stunning validation of Station Hypo at Midway, the Redmond brothers weren't finished. They pressed Admiral King with a damaging argument. Station Hypo had gotten lucky, not skilled. Real code-breaking, they insisted, demanded Washington's tight command. By October 1942, Rochefort found himself stripped of authority and reassigned to oversee a floating dry dock. For the man who'd made Midway's victory possible, it was a crushing fall. Yet breaking JN-25 demanded something extraordinary: unprecedented teamwork across nations and oceans. The British Far East Combined Bureau, established in Hong Kong back in 1935, had actually cracked JN-25 first, back in 1939. John Tiltman, working at Bletchley Park, found the system's skeleton and spotted the divisibility pattern that marked every legitimate code group. When Japan rolled out JN-25B on December 1, 1940, the British spotted something invaluable immediately. The Japanese had swapped the code book, but left the additive tables untouched. This opened a window. Messages from late November and December could be lined up against each other, the encryption stripped away layer by layer. By March 1941, the British had recovered nearly 3,000 code groups and handed them to the Americans. The Dutch brought their own crucial piece through Kama 14 at Bandung Technical College in Java, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Leo Brewer. Since 1936, the Dutch had been catching Japanese naval radio signals and understood Japanese communication patterns inside and out. When Java fell in March 1942, Brewer's people bolted for Australia, carrying punch cards filled with partially decrypted material. Before evacuation, Station Cast in Carregador made one final breakthrough. They pinpointed AF as the Japanese code name for Midway, then transmitted this find to Station Hypo just as they were being pulled out. Those 74 personnel proved so vital, they got evacuated across multiple submarine missions between February and April 1942, regrouping later as Frumel in Melbourne. The coordination between these scattered units seemed impossible, given the vast distances and communications limitations. Decrypted messages flowed through secure cables. Recovered code groups traveled in diplomatic pouches. Radio coverage was orchestrated to prevent blind spots. By May 1942, the Allies were catching roughly 60% of Japanese naval radio traffic, though they could only read about 40% of what they intercepted. Japan's naval brass never realized their codes were compromised, falling victim to structural breakdowns in their own intelligence system. The Navy split intelligence work between the 3rd Department, Intelligence, and 4th Department Communications. These divisions created walls between departments that prevented real security checks. After the war, Captain Itaro Tachibana, who ran the 3rd Department's American section, admitted the truth. We had no way to connect operational disasters with possible code problems. When American forces materialized in perfect positions, operations blamed bad reconnaissance. Nobody suspected the Americans might be reading their messages. Japanese Navy security actually helped the code breakers. Message writers had to include full titles and unit information, offering precious context clues. Confirmation messages restated portions of the original transmission. Daily weather reports, sent at fixed times, gave predictable starting points for attacks. Physical security lapses went completely undetected. On January 20, 1942, submarine I-124 sank in shallow water near Darwin. It carried current code books that Australian divers could potentially reach. The Japanese made no emergency code changes, betting the water would be too deep for salvage. They miscalculated. Australian divers pulled up significant cryptographic material within days and handed it to American codebreakers. 3 days after Midway, on June 7, 1942, the Chicago Tribune published a piece that should have exposed everything. The headline screamed, "Navy had word of Jap plan to strike at sea." Reporter Stanley Johnston disclosed details that only code-breaking could produce. Johnston had been aboard the carrier Lexington when it went down at Coral Sea, and he'd seen classified messages while convalescing on the cruiser Chester. His article laid out Japanese force composition, specific ship names, and operational plans. It screamed compromise. President Roosevelt was livid, considering charges under the Espionage Act. Navy Secretary Frank Knox wanted Tribune publisher Colonel Robert McCormick court-martialed, even though McCormick was a civilian. The Navy prepared charges that could mean execution. Yet shockingly, Japanese intelligence completely missed it. No Japanese spy in America reported the article. No neutral diplomat mentioned it. No German intelligence officer warned their Japanese allies. The news that should have forced immediate code changes simply vanished, unnoticed. The grand jury hearings threatened worse damage than the original article. Prosecutors would need to explain exactly what Johnston revealed and why it mattered. testimony that would confirm American code-breaking success. The Navy recognized this danger and dropped all charges, leaving the Tribune unpunished, but miraculously keeping the secret safe. For the cryptanalysts at Station Hypo, Midway's victory brought not relief but mounting pressure. They understood the Japanese would eventually alter their codes, potentially crippling American intelligence when it mattered most. Each day, JN-25 remained readable, felt like borrowed time. The mental toll was brutal. These people knew when Japanese convoys would depart, where submarines would hunt, which islands would be attacked. They held information that could save thousands of American lives, but using it too openly would signal the code was broken. Rochefort created strict rules for hiding intelligence sources. Every piece of decoded information needed a believable cover story. If intercepts showed a convoy path, commanders heard it came from submarine contacts. When decrypts unveiled invasion plans, the intelligence got blamed on captured paperwork. The strain was visible. Thomas Dyer developed sleeplessness so severe he saw code groups every time he closed his eyes. Wesley Wright battled constant dread, dreading the moment when code changes would black out American intelligence. Joseph Finnegan drank to excess, struggling against memories of Japanese messages describing American prisoners that he'd translated but couldn't act upon without exposing the source. Nothing showed both the magnificent potential and dangerous risks of code-breaking, like what happened to Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1943. In early April, Station Hypo's successor organization intercepted a message laying out Yamamoto's complete inspection itinerary through Solomon Island bases. The message, sent in JN-25D, stated precisely that Yamamoto would touch down at Balali Island at 09:45 on April 18th, traveling in a Betty bomber escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The detail was extraordinary. Japanese staff officers had documented everything, confident their communication was completely shielded. Admiral Nimitz faced an agonizing choice. Yamamoto stood as Japan's supreme naval mind, Pearl Harbor's architect. Killing him would shatter Japanese confidence, but timing an ambush exactly when and where the intercept specified would obviously reveal the code was broken. The decision went to President Roosevelt, who reportedly simply answered, "Get him." American strategists devised a careful deception. P-38 Lightning fighters would fly a 435-mile intercept path just above the waves. Additional patrols would operate in the region, creating the appearance of normal operations. Coast watchers would receive credit for detecting Yamamoto's aircraft. On April 18th, exactly as the message predicted, Yamamoto's plane approached over Bougainville. American P-38s destroyed both Betty bombers, killing Yamamoto and his entourage. Japan's navy was shattered, yet they only made routine code adjustments. An investigation concluded local commanders had been slack with security, never suspecting code compromise lay behind the ambush. By late 1942, JN-25 breaking had transformed from skilled work into mechanized operation. The expanded Station Hypo, now Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, occupied an entire building floor at Pearl Harbor. IBM machines hummed continuously in climate-controlled spaces. 3 rotating shifts of cryptanalysts, translators, and intelligence officers processed thousands of messages around the clock. The organization was stunning. Young women from Hawaii's commercial world, trained as punch card operators, entered intercepted code groups at rapid speed. IBM machines sorted the cards by frequency, spotting potential starting points. Cryptanalysts exploited identified weaknesses, uncovering fresh code groups and additives. Translators transformed broken messages into English, while intelligence officers took hundreds of partial decrypts and assembled them into workable reports. Verification became essential. Every recovered code group faced cross-checking against multiple messages. Translation disagreements went to committee, with Japanese language experts making final calls. Intelligence reports noted confidence levels, separating proven information from reasonable estimates. The scope was immense. By January 1943, Frupak maintained a punch card collection numbering millions. Daily, the IBM machines ran millions of comparisons. Monthly power expenses matched a small town's bill. Yet beneath all this machine work, human skill remained indispensable. Only seasoned linguists could recognize that certain code groups meant familiar Japanese expressions. Only officers versed in Japanese military strategy could grasp operational meaning. While Midway dominated newspapers, JN-25's actual devastation fell on Japan's commercial fleet through intelligence operations. By 1943, American submarines were destroying Japanese vessels faster than replacement could happen, cutting off an island nation starved for imports. Intelligence transformed everything. Decrypts disclosed convoy paths, timing, and defensive strength. Submarine commanders got decoded intelligence, placing them at specific coordinates where unprotected fuel ships would surface. Japan, unaware their codes were exposed, attributed losses to expanding submarine numbers rather than intelligence lapses. USS Tang's commander Richard O'Kane got a decoded message in October 1944, revealing a convoy carrying aviation fuel from Borneo to the Philippines. With intelligence positioning him perfectly, Tang eliminated 7 ships in a single night, denying Japanese flyers critical fuel during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The numbers were brutal. American submarines, less than 2% of Navy personnel, destroyed over 30% of Japan's warships and 60% of its merchant marine. Code intelligence made much of this feasible, showing not simply where ships would be, but what cargo they held and how they'd be protected. By late 1944, Japan had consumed so many tankers that warships ran dry. Flight training stopped because aviation fuel vanished. Island bases went hungry because food shipments never showed up. Japan's industrial system crumbled as raw materials halted. All stemmed from submarines guided by intelligence Japan didn't realize was compromised. Throughout 1943 and 1944, proof of code compromise accumulated at levels that should have been obvious. American submarines consistently found convoys in their weakest spots. American carriers manifested exactly where Japanese planning said they wouldn't appear. American operations targeted Japanese assaults while leaving other zones unguarded. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's replacement, wrote in his personal diary, "The enemy seems to possess a sixth sense about our operations. Every action is accounted for, every strategy foreseen." Yet even this near discovery didn't motivate serious security reassessment. The Japanese did refresh JN-25 periodically, introducing modifications roughly every half year. JN-25C debuted May 28, 1942, arriving too late for Midway. JN-25D ran from August 1942 through March 1943. Each transition temporarily cut American readability, never lasting beyond a couple weeks. The system's core stayed constant, and American cryptanalysts had become remarkably fast at recovering fresh code groups. Japan's naval command clung to faith in their code despite mounting evidence. In November 1943, an intercept exposed a reinforcement convoy's exact route to Rabaul. American destroyers ambushed and destroyed every transport. Commander Kato Tetsuo, a communications specialist who endured, reported afterward, "The Americans positioned themselves precisely where we shifted direction. They must have cracked our codes." This testimony got dismissed as combat stress. Kato got moved to shore duty and instructed to abandon his supposed delusions. For those who'd broken JN-25, triumph carried ethical weight they couldn't escape. Their accomplishment meant demise for countless Japanese sailors executing their responsibilities. Each decoded message pinpointing ships meant direct body counts. Alva Laswell, the Marine translator, confessed in personal correspondence, "I broke the message directing Yamamoto's death. I'd studied his writings, comprehended his mind. When I decoded his schedule, I determined his fate. That burden persists." The psychological cost intensified when intercepts uncovered hospital ships, prisoner vessels, or refugee transports. International treaties safeguarded these ships, yet authentic identification frequently came through decoded messages alone. The cryptanalysts navigated agonizing dilemmas: disclose intelligence preserving civilian lives but revealing code compromise, or stay silent. Some of the intercepted messages contained evidence of Japanese war crimes so serious that acting on them would have meant revealing how the Americans obtained their intelligence. Joseph Dyer, one of the station's senior analysts, later acknowledged this agonizing reality. We intercepted transmissions documenting executions of prisoners. These discoveries forced us into an impossible position. We had to suppress the information, recognizing that exposure would compromise our access to all subsequent intelligence streams. The weight of this knowledge created profound psychological consequences for those involved. Certain code breakers became consumed with achieving flawless accuracy. Their anxiety rooted in the terrifying possibility that even minor mistakes might result in American deaths. Others responded differently, developing an emotional distance that allowed them to view intercepted communications as abstract mathematical problems rather than intelligence about real warfare and loss of life. Many wrestled with the guilt of remaining secure, while others faced combat. Some who had guided military operations from safety behind desks struggled knowing that soldiers they had helped direct were dying on distant beaches. Yet despite years of official indifference and institutional mistreatment, the historical record has ultimately vindicated these operations and their orchestrators. Admiral Chester Nimitz left no room for ambiguity in his assessment. Without the intelligence Rochefort's group provided, the Pacific Campaign would have stretched at least another 2 years into the future, bringing with it hundreds of thousands of additional casualties. General Douglas MacArthur similarly acknowledged their indispensable contribution. Through the Navy's cryptanalysts, we gained the ability to see what our opponents were doing and hear what they were planning. The Pacific Ocean transformed from a mysterious expanse into a predictable theater where we anticipated every Japanese maneuver before it occurred. Even post-war Japanese military analysts conceded the decisive importance of this intelligence advantage. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka from Japan's Defense Academy offered this reflection. The compromise of the JN-25 cipher represented a defeat more catastrophic than any conventional military loss. Throughout those years of conflict, Japan faced an adversary blessed with seemingly supernatural knowledge of every strategic intention. The true significance of Station Hypo's work cannot be measured merely by battles fought, but by battles prevented through superior knowledge. Understanding what the Japanese intended meant American commanders could position forces with surgical precision where they mattered most, leaving secondary areas less defended. This intelligence-enabled efficiency allowed the United States to wage simultaneous warfare across 2 vast oceans, with resources that would have proven inadequate without the advantages provided by successful code-breaking. Yet recognition arrived with agonizing slowness. Rochefort's situation was particularly troubling. Despite Nimitz's strong advocacy that Rochefort receive the Distinguished Service Medal, Admiral King intervened to block the award. In October of 1942, Rochefort lost his command, reassigned to oversee a floating dry dock facility. His intelligence career effectively terminated. The recognition finally materialized in 1986, nearly a decade after his death, when President Reagan presented the medal at the White House to Rochefort's son, a hollow gesture that could never compensate for 4 decades of official rejection and professional marginalization. The post-war discovery that Americans had deciphered their communications devastated Japanese naval officers far more than any tactical or strategic defeat. During debriefing sessions with Allied interrogators, many Japanese commanders initially dismissed the claims as impossible. They demanded proof, and when shown actual decrypted messages they themselves had sent years earlier, the psychological impact proved shattering. The realization struck them with terrible force. They had been combating an enemy who possessed intimate knowledge of their innermost thoughts and plans. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had served as the Combined Fleet's Chief of Staff, spoke about this during his 1949 interrogation with visible distress. Had we understood that you were intercepting our communications, we would have fundamentally restructured every aspect of our war strategy, abandoned our existing tactical approaches, and accepted entirely different risks and vulnerabilities. We fought essentially blinded. Captain Wanitsu Nezo, director of the Naval Intelligence Division, expressed even sharper self-recrimination. The failure to identify that our codes had been compromised was utterly indefensible and unforgivable. The evidence had surrounded them constantly. Your undersea vessels appeared in exactly the right locations. Your carrier task forces materialized where we least anticipated them. In every instance, we attributed these phenomena to exceptionally capable reconnaissance operations and stubbornly rejected the notion that something far worse had occurred. This discovery sparked profound institutional questioning that persists within Japanese military circles even today. How could an intelligence establishment that had successfully broken Russian communications during the Russo-Japanese War allow such catastrophic failure in protecting its own cipher systems? The explanation encompasses multiple dimensions: insufficient understanding of modern technology, dangerous organizational arrogance, and inflexible institutional thinking. The Japanese intelligence community had fundamentally misunderstood the technological revolution that IBM's computational machinery represented. While their personnel labored with pencil and paper encryption techniques, Americans operated sophisticated electronic systems, processing enormous volumes of cipher material instantaneously. The technological disparity proved decisive, one side fighting with 19th-century methods, while the other wielded state-of-the-art innovation. The successful penetration of JN-25 established enduring principles that continue directing signals intelligence operations in the present day. The operation conclusively demonstrated that with sufficient intercepted traffic, sufficient computational capability, and sufficient human brilliance, no encryption scheme remains permanently secure. It validated the fundamental truth that human behavior, the shortcuts, the habitual patterns, the predictable responses that emerge under operational stress, represents the vulnerability most difficult to defend. The operational model created to break JN-25, linking intercept facilities, analytical centers, and distributed processing capabilities, became the foundational template for modern intelligence architecture. The Five Eyes Partnership, uniting the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, originated directly from the collaborative relationships built during the assault on Japanese encryption systems. The moral and strategic principles established at Station Hypo continue shaping intelligence work today. The commitment to protecting sources and methods, even when this means accepting tactical disadvantage in the moment, remains foundational doctrine. The integration of signals intelligence with operational command decisions, developed collaboratively by Rochefort and Nimitz, has become standardized military practice. Most significantly, JN-25 illustrated that intelligence superiority can fundamentally reverse material disadvantage. Standing in June 1942, the Japanese Navy possessed clear advantages in numbers, operational experience, and military hardware. Yet American codebreakers neutralized these advantages, allowing numerically inferior forces to achieve overwhelming victory through information superiority. The Japanese Navy's intelligence catastrophe, though devastating, transmits warnings that retain their urgency. That same dangerous confidence that prevented Japanese cryptographers from recognizing their vulnerability resurfaces continually in every generation's assessment of its own security. Today's supposedly impenetrable encryption systems may become elementary problems for tomorrow's quantum computers or artificial intelligence systems. Japan's rigid compartmentalization structure, which blocked comprehensive security evaluation, mirrors the bureaucratic silos in modern organizations that prevent effective counterintelligence safeguarding. The human vulnerabilities that compromise JN-25, complacency, mechanical routine, predictable behavior, persist as fundamental threats to every contemporary cryptographic system. Perhaps most troubling is the psychological component. The Japanese Navy could not accept the possibility that their codes had been broken because such an outcome seemed to violate the natural order. This blind certainty about their own superiority prevented even considering the unthinkable. Every modern intelligence establishment harbors similar psychological limitations, assuming that certain developments remain impossible until they unexpectedly materialize through technological innovation or creative thinking. Military institutions worldwide examine the JN-25 failure as an instructive cautionary example, yet frequently overlook its most essential teaching. The adversary you dismiss as incapable represents your greatest danger. The American cryptanalysts laboring in the Pearl Harbor basement, scorned by Japanese intelligence specialists as intellectually incapable of understanding Japanese cryptography, destroyed the Imperial Navy through patient mathematical analysis and mechanical calculation. In 1985, the surviving members of Station Hypo organized their first and final reunion gathering in San Antonio, Texas. Barely 30 veterans arrived, reduced from the original force by advancing age, geographical separation, and death. They convened not as celebrated heroes receiving national honors, but as aging men whose most momentous accomplishment remained largely unknown and unacknowledged. Thomas Dyer, now 83, delivered the reunion's keynote remarks. "We were code breakers and linguists, not traditional soldiers. We waged our particular war using pencils and calculating equipment, not rifles and explosives. Yet through our efforts, we sent more Japanese vessels to the ocean floor than any battle group could have accomplished, and we preserved more American lives than any hospital corps ever saved. We operated then in shadow, and shadow remains our permanent residence." Joseph Finnegan, maintaining sobriety after 2 decades of recovery but still carrying the emotional aftermath of his experiences, offered his reflection. "Each message we translated carried human consequences. Japanese sailors destined for death, American pilots who would survive. Every success felt like celebrating, yet we were simply performing our assignments and responsibilities. That psychological burden persists and will never entirely fade." The reunion's most emotionally powerful instance arrived when the assembled group raised their glasses in remembrance of Joe Rochford, deceased for 9 years, yet eternally their guiding spirit and inspiration. Rochford's son received a flag that had been flown over Pearl Harbor on June 4, 1982, marking the 40th anniversary of Midway. The accompanying statement simply read, "To the individual whose actions made triumph achievable." The extraordinary magnitude of the American code-breaking accomplishment becomes evident when examining the concrete metrics, demonstrating both the scope of the undertaking and its transformative consequences. The infrastructure supporting code-breaking operations, including Station Hypo, maintained between 30 and 50 personnel during the crucial Midway campaign, subsequently expanding to more than 100 by late 1942 at the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific location. The total workforce engaged in Pacific cryptanalysis numbered 738 by December 1941, multiplying to more than 5,000 by war's conclusion. 5 substantial processing facilities operated across the Pacific region. IBM Computing Systems managed millions of comparative analyses hourly. Recovery of JN-25 proceeded incrementally. By December 1941, personnel could partially read between 10 and 15% of intercepted traffic. April 1942 saw this increase to 20% comprehension. May 1942, the Midway operation achieved readability of 40% of code group recovery. December 1942 reached 60% decryption capability. As the conflict concluded, the team had recovered nearly complete understanding of most code variants. The operational consequences proved staggering. At Midway, 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed, while America lost a single carrier. The submarine offensive resulted in 1,314 Japanese vessel sinkings. Japanese merchant marine tonnage suffered 60% destruction. American casualties prevented numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The intelligence failures on the Japanese side were equally stark. 0 successful recognitions that codes had been compromised. Numerous warning indicators that should have precipitated security investigations were systematically disregarded. Not even the assassination of Admiral Yamamoto prompted thorough investigation. Following cessation of hostilities, numerous surviving officers continued refusing to acknowledge that their cipher had been broken. The cryptographic contest unfolding across the Pacific became an early manifestation of technology-driven conflict that would characterize future wars. The Japanese depended on printed cipher books and hand-performed encipherment, relying fundamentally on 19th-century methodology. Americans deployed sophisticated computational machinery instead. The IBM systems operating at Station Hypo executed thousands of comparative operations every hour, identifying mathematical patterns requiring months of human computational labor to discover. Engineers implemented specialized adjustments, enabling business calculation devices to perform cryptanalytic operations far beyond their original conception. The technology seems elementary by contemporary standards, yet it represented revolutionary capability for that historical moment. The Japanese maintained conviction that manual systems provided superior security precisely because mechanical analysis seemed impossible to apply against them. This strategic misapprehension ensured their cryptographic approach would ultimately fail. They neglected developing mechanical encryption equipment equivalent to the German Enigma machines, never created computational processing comparable to American methods, never grasped that mathematical machinery could overcome mathematical complexity. During 1944, American cryptanalysts were pushing technological boundaries even further. Experimental systems using telephone switching mechanisms could assault super-enciphered code material. Photographic procedures accelerated the recording and duplication of recovered cipher values. Radio teletype technology enabled nearly instantaneous transmission of decoded intelligence across vast distances. Each successive development expanded the technological gap between American capabilities and Japanese expectations and assumptions. Joe Rochefort expired on July 20, 1976, at a hospital in Torrance, California. During his final hospital admission, he granted one concluding interview from his medical bed, able only to raise himself partially upright, speaking in barely perceptible tones. People frequently ask whether I harbor resentment regarding how I was treated. The answer is negative. The work itself contained intrinsic satisfaction and reward. The significance came from every Japanese message decoded, every American life protected through that knowledge. That recognition meant more than any formal award could represent. We demonstrated that modern warfare operates according to different principles than earlier conflicts. Information constitutes a more potent weapon than firepower itself. A modest group laboring in obscurity beneath Pearl Harbor proved more effective against the Japanese Navy than any conventional naval engagement could possibly have been. We eliminated vessels through mathematical reasoning, dismantled tactical plans through analytical thought, destroyed operational concepts through superior understanding. The deeper message extends beyond cryptography itself. It concerns hubris and overconfidence. The Japanese possessed such profound faith in their inherent superiority that they dismissed the possibility of being outmaneuvered through intellect. They mistakenly equated intricacy with security, mistakenly associated tradition with genuine strength. They never comprehended that complacency represents humanity's most dangerous condition. I invested 3 years absorbing the private communications of Japanese senior commanders. The experience created a peculiar form of connection, understanding adversaries with greater depth than they comprehended themselves. Through intercepted messages they believed utterly confidential, I witnessed their world contracting, their circumstances deteriorating, their dominion dissolving. If one regret haunts me, it concerns the numerous team members who departed without receiving deserved recognition. They represented genuine heroism, warriors wielding pencils and mechanical calculators instead of conventional weapons. History carries an obligation to remember them appropriately. The Japanese never comprehended that JN-25 had been penetrated, and certain survivors maintain this disbelief even now. But we knew, and that comprehension brought both exhilaration and profound responsibility. From a basement beneath Pearl Harbor, we redirected history's course. The JN-25 narrative and the individuals who decrypted it constitutes one of recorded history's most remarkable intelligence achievements. A determined group of American cryptanalysts employing rudimentary computing technology and unwavering dedication methodically dismantled Japanese naval communication security, fundamentally altering World War II's trajectory. The Japanese Navy remained completely unaware that their most confidential cipher had been thoroughly compromised. Throughout the 3-year conflict, through inexplicable defeats suggesting impossible circumstances, they maintained complete confidence in a system that revealed every strategic intention. This profound miscalculation, rooted in arrogance and institutional dysfunction, ultimately determined Japan's destiny. The Americans who decrypted JN-25 received minimal acknowledgement during their years of life. Rochefort's career was systematically dismantled as retribution for his achievements. His colleagues were dispersed and forced into silence. Their accomplishment remained classified for decades, Yet their unseen success probably represented the Pacific War's most consequential achievement. As we navigate an era of quantum computing and advanced encryption, JN25's teachings retain contemporary relevance. Every encryption system contains inherent limitations and vulnerabilities. Complete security remains perpetually elusive. The human dimension, inattention, habitual patterns, excessive certainty, continues representing the most intractable security threat. The organizational insularity that prevented Japan from recognizing its vulnerability parallels contemporary institutional compartmentalization that undermines counterintelligence effectiveness. Station Hypo's basement now stores miscellaneous items. The computational equipment has long since been discarded, the participants mostly forgotten, yet their influence persists throughout every code-breaking operation, every encrypted message penetrated, every enemy communication intercepted. They established that patient dedication, exceptional talent, and systematic assault against enemy secrecy determine wars as thoroughly as conventional weaponry. The Japanese Navy never discovered that American codebreakers had deciphered their JN25 encryption. This absence of knowledge cost them their naval supremacy, their military capabilities, ultimately their war itself. Regarding intelligence failure, none compares in completeness, in devastating consequences, in preventability to Japan's misplaced faith in a code penetrated by Americans, toiling in obscurity, intercepting everything, comprehending everything, patiently orchestrating the enemy's eventual destruction. This chronicle imparts an essential truth regarding intelligence operations. Your greatest vulnerability emerges not from adversaries who know your secrets, but from those whose surveillance you never suspect. The Imperial Navy grasped this principle only after surrender became inevitable. Learning then that the entire war had been conducted under constant observation by American cryptanalysts, who anticipated their movements, hastened their defeats, and extinguished forever the rising sun's dominance across the Pacific.